The fluorescent lights hung overhead as James Rodriguez pushed his cleaning cart down the marble-floored corridor of Pinnacle Industries. It was nearly midnight, and the 42nd floor should have been empty, but soft sobbing echoed from the executive secretary pool. What James discovered next would expose a web of workplace abuse that reached the highest levels of corporate power. A young woman sat hunched over her desk, tears streaming down her face as crumpled papers surrounded her like fallen leaves. James had seen this before, had watched his late wife Sarah endure the same crushing humiliation from supervisors who saw kindness as weakness. But when he knelt beside Emily Harper's desk and whispered those three simple words, he had no idea that someone else was listening, someone whose reaction would shake the entire company to its core. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. James Rodriguez had been cleaning office buildings for 12 years, ever since his wife Sarah passed away from cancer, leaving him to raise their 8-year-old daughter Lucy alone. The night shift at Pinnacle Industries paid well enough to cover Lucy's school fees and their small apartment rent, though it meant he rarely saw her except for breakfast and weekends. At 52, his hands bore the calluses of honest work, and his graying temples spoke of sleepless nights spent worrying about making ends meet while trying to be both mother and father to a growing girl. The 42nd floor of Pinnacle Industries housed the executive offices of one of the city's most powerful corporations. During the day, it buzzed with the energy of high-stakes business deals, multi-million-dollar negotiations, and the constant hum of ambition. But at night, it belonged to James and the handful of other maintenance workers who kept the gleaming facades spotless for the morning's parade of suits and briefcases. James had developed a rhythm over the years. Start with the corner offices, work his way through the conference rooms, then finish with the open workspace where the secretaries and junior executives spent their days. He knew every squeaky wheel on his cart, every stubborn stain on the carpets, every window that required extra elbow grease to shine. The work was honest and solitary, giving him time to think about Lucy's upcoming school play, the grocery list stuck to their refrigerator, and the college fund that grew painfully slowly despite his careful budgeting. Tonight felt different from the moment he stepped off the elevator. The usual silence was broken by a sound that made his chest tighten with recognition, the muffled sobs of someone trying desperately not to be heard. James had heard that sound before, echoing through their small apartment during Sarah's final months, when the treatments stopped working and hope became a luxury they could no longer afford. But this wasn't a sound of physical pain. It was something else entirely. Something that reminded him of the night Sarah came home from her job at the insurance company. Her spirit crushed by a supervisor who took pleasure in making her feel small and worthless. He followed the sound to the secretary pool, a cluster of desks arranged in neat rows beneath the watchful gaze of floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city's skyline. The lights were dimmed, casting long shadows across the workspace, but a single desk lamp illuminated a scene that made James's protective instincts flare to life. Emily Harper sat at her desk with her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the effort of containing her grief. She was 26 years old, though the stress lines around her eyes made her look older in the harsh fluorescent light. Her dark hair, usually styled in a professional chignon, had come loose from its pins, and mascara streaked down her cheeks like black tears. Scattered across her desk were dozens of reports, each one marked with angry red ink corrections and harsh comments scrawled in the margins. Emily had been working at Pinnacle Industries for 3 years, ever since graduating with a business degree that was supposed to open doors to a bright future. Instead, she found herself trapped in a position that paid barely enough to cover her student loans and rent on a studio apartment in the city's most affordable neighborhood. Her supervisor, Margaret Blackstone, seemed to take personal satisfaction in finding fault with Emily's work, no matter how perfectly executed it might be. James paused at the edge of the workspace, his cleaning cart's wheels locked in place. Every instinct told him to respect her privacy, to quietly clean around her, and pretend he hadn't witnessed this moment of vulnerability. But the sound of her crying transported him back to those terrible months when Sarah would come home defeated, her confidence eroded by daily humiliations that seemed designed to break her spirit. "She made me redo the Henderson report 6 times, Emily whispered to herself, her voice barely audible above the building's ambient hum. 6 times, and each time she found something wrong with it. The formatting, the font choice, the way I organized the data. Nothing was ever good enough. Margaret Blackstone was 58 years old and had clawed her way up from secretary to department supervisor through 3 decades of ruthless ambition. She ruled her domain with an iron fist, treating the younger employees like indentured servants rather than valued team members. Margaret had perfected the art of workplace bullying, never crossing the line into behavior that could be documented as harassment, but making life miserable for anyone she perceived as a threat to her authority. Emily's crime had been simple. She was young, educated, and showed promise. In Margaret's twisted worldview, these qualities made Emily dangerous, someone who might eventually challenge her position or expose her incompetence to the executives upstairs. So Margaret had embarked on a systematic campaign to destroy Emily's confidence, criticizing her work, undermining her contributions in meetings, and ensuring that any success was credited to others, while any failures were laid squarely at Emily's feet. James thought about Lucy, safely asleep in her bed at home, and wondered what kind of world he was leaving for her to navigate as a working woman. Would she face the same casual cruelty that had broken Sarah's spirit and was now crushing this young stranger? The thought filled him with a familiar rage, tempered by the helplessness that came from understanding how little power he had to change the system. But standing there in the dimly lit office, watching Emily's shoulders shake with barely contained sobs, James realized that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply acknowledge another person's pain. He thought about the nights Sarah had needed nothing more than someone to tell her that her feelings were valid, that she deserved better than the treatment she was receiving. James cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle her. Emily looked up, her eyes wide with embarrassment at being caught in such a vulnerable moment. She quickly wiped her face with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself, despite the obvious evidence of her distress. "I'm sorry," Emily said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I know I shouldn't be here this late. I was just trying to finish the Morrison presentation for tomorrow's board meeting. My supervisor needed it perfect, and I wanted to make sure there were no mistakes she could find." James set down his spray bottle and approached her desk slowly, his movements careful and unthreatening. He had learned to read people during his years of night shift work, and he could see that Emily was wound tight as a spring, exhausted from trying to meet impossible standards while maintaining a facade of professional competence. "You don't need to apologize," James said gently, his voice carrying the warmth that had comforted Lucy through countless childhood fears and disappointments. "We all have those nights when the work feels heavier than it should." Emily studied his face, surprised by the kindness she found there. She had become so accustomed to criticism and judgment that genuine compassion felt foreign, almost suspicious. But something in James's eyes reminded her of her father, who had worked double shifts at a factory to put her through college, who had believed in her potential even when she struggled to believe in herself. "I've been here since 7 this morning," Emily continued, the words tumbling out as if a dam had burst. "I've rewritten this presentation so many times that I've lost count. Each version gets returned with more corrections, more suggestions for improvement. I'm starting to think that maybe I'm just not cut out for this kind of work." James knelt beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level in a gesture that reminded Emily of her elementary school teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had always knelt down when speaking to her students to make them feel heard and valued. The parallel struck Emily as oddly comforting, a reminder that kindness still existed in a world that often felt cold and unforgiving. "Can I tell you something?" James asked, his voice low and gentle. "My wife used to come home from work looking exactly like you do right now. She was brilliant, one of the smartest people I ever knew, but her supervisor seemed determined to make her feel worthless. Every day she'd question whether she was good enough, whether she belonged in that office." Emily wiped her eyes again, intrigued despite her emotional state. There was something about James's presence that felt safe, paternal in a way that made her want to listen rather than retreat into her shell of professional politeness. "What happened to her?" Emily asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Cancer took her 5 years ago," James replied, his voice steady despite the pain that still lived in his chest like a permanent resident. "But before that, She found the courage to stand up to that supervisor, filed a complaint with Human Resources, documented every instance of harassment and intimidation. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but eventually the company had to take action. James reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, extracting a worn photograph of Sarah holding baby Lucy in the hospital. Sarah's face glowed with new mother's joy, her eyes bright with hope for the future. It was taken 12 years ago, but James carried it everywhere, a reminder of the woman who had taught him that love could be fierce enough to challenge injustice. She used to tell me that the hardest part wasn't the work itself, it was feeling like she had to prove her worth every single day. James continued, like she was guilty of something just by existing in that space. But you know what she learned? That their treatment of her said everything about them, and nothing about her actual value as a person. Emily stared at the photograph, seeing echoes of her own mother in Sarah's gentle smile. Her mother had worked as a nurse for 30 years, facing discrimination and harassment from doctors who saw her as inferior despite her expertise and dedication. Emily had watched her mother come home exhausted, not just from the physical demands of her job, but from the emotional toll of constantly having to prove herself worthy of basic respect. I keep thinking that maybe if I just work harder, if I'm more careful with my reports, if I anticipate every possible criticism, then maybe she'll see that I'm capable, Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. But it feels like no matter what I do, it's never enough. James nodded, recognizing the familiar trap of trying to earn approval from someone determined to withhold it. Sarah had spent months trying to perfect herself for a supervisor who had no interest in acknowledging her competence, who thrived on maintaining power through systematic demoralization. "You deserve better," James said, the words carrying the weight of every conversation he'd had with Sarah during those difficult years. "Not because you're perfect, not because you've earned it through superhuman effort, but because you're a human being who shows up every day and does her best. That should be enough." The simple statement hit Emily like a revelation. She had been so focused on meeting Margaret's impossible standards that she had lost sight of her own inherent worth. For 3 years, she had internalized Margaret's criticisms, accepting the narrative that her struggles were evidence of personal failure rather than systematic abuse. "You deserve better," James repeated, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had learned this lesson through painful experience. And somewhere in this building, there are people who would recognize that if they knew what was really happening down here. Emily felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of anxiety and self-doubt that had become her constant companion. James's words weren't just sympathy or empty encouragement. They were a recognition of her fundamental dignity as a person, something that Margaret had been systematically eroding through months of calculated cruelty. "I used to love this work," Emily admitted, gesturing to the reports scattered across her desk. "I was good at it in college and during my internship at the regional office. But here, it feels like I'm constantly walking on eggshells, afraid that any small mistake will prove that I don't belong." James looked at the reports, noting the complexity of the data analysis and the professional quality of Emily's writing. Despite the harsh red corrections that covered nearly every page, it was clear that the problems weren't with Emily's competence, but with a supervisor who seemed determined to find fault regardless of the actual quality of the work. "Sarah used to say that you can't make sense of senseless behavior," James offered. "Some people are so threatened by others' potential that they'll do anything to keep them down. It's not about your work, it's about their fear." Emily nodded, beginning to see her situation with new clarity. Margaret's behavior wasn't random or even particularly personal. It was a calculated strategy designed to maintain power through intimidation. Understanding this didn't make the daily humiliations any easier to bear, but it helped Emily separate Margaret's dysfunction from her own barack. Professional worth. "Oh, I've been thinking about quitting," Emily confessed, the words feeling dangerous even as they brought relief. "I lie awake at night wondering if I should just find something else, maybe go back to school, try a completely different career path." James studied her face, seeing the exhaustion that came from months of psychological warfare disguised as professional development. He thought about Lucy, about the world she would inherit, about the importance of people like Emily standing their ground, rather than being driven away by bullies in expensive suits. That might be the right choice for you, James said carefully. But it might also be exactly what she's hoping for. Some people count on wearing others down until they give up and walk away. It means they never have to face consequences for their behavior. Emily considered this, thinking about her college friends who had left similar situations. Talented women who had abandoned their career goals because the daily grind of workplace harassment had become unbearable. How many capable people had Margaret driven away over the years? How many potential contributions to the company had been lost because one person's insecurity had been allowed to flourish unchecked? I documented everything, Emily said suddenly, the words surprising her as they emerged. Every criticism, every impossible deadline, every time she took credit for my work or blamed me for things that weren't my fault. I started keeping records after the first month, thinking maybe I was being too sensitive and needed to track patterns to see if I was imagining things. James felt a flicker of hope. Sarah had done the same thing, creating a paper trail that had ultimately proven invaluable when she finally decided to file a formal complaint. Documentation was the difference between he said, she said allegations and a clear pattern of abuse that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. That was smart, James told her. And it tells me that despite what you've been told, your instincts are solid. You recognized something was wrong, and you took steps to protect yourself. That takes wisdom and courage. Emily felt tears welling up again, but this time they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of relief, of recognition, of finally feeling seen and heard, after months of being made to feel invisible and insignificant. James's validation meant more to her than any performance review or professional accolade, because it acknowledged her as a complete person, rather than just a set of skills to be evaluated. Neither of them noticed the figure standing in the shadows near the elevator bank, someone who had been working late in the corner office and had come out to investigate the unusual sounds coming from the secretary pool. Alexander Hawthorne, the company's chief executive officer, had been heading home after a long day of merger negotiations when he heard voices carrying across the empty floor. Alexander was 45 years old, a man who had built Pinnacle Industries from a small consulting firm into a multinational corporation through a combination of strategic vision and ruthless execution. He was known for his demanding standards and intolerance for inefficiency, but also for his commitment to ethical business practices and employee development. The contradiction in his reputation came from the fact that while he set high expectations, he also believed in providing the resources and support necessary for people to meet those standards. Alexander had made it a practice to walk the floors occasionally during off hours, partly to observe the operation from a different perspective, and partly because he genuinely enjoyed the quiet atmosphere of the empty offices. Tonight's walk had been motivated by insomnia brought on by the stress of the Morrison acquisition, a deal that would either elevate Pinnacle Industries to new heights or expose critical weaknesses in their operational structure. He moved closer to the secretary pool, staying in the shadows to avoid interrupting what was clearly a private conversation. Alexander wasn't an eavesdropper by nature, but something about the janitor's tone had caught his attention, a gentleness and wisdom that seemed out of place in the corporate environment he knew so well. The thing about bullies, James was saying, is that they count on isolation. They want you to think you're the only one experiencing their behavior, that it must be your fault because surely someone would have spoken up if it was really as bad as it seems. Alexander frowned, his business instincts immediately recognizing the implications of what he was hearing. Workplace harassment wasn't just morally wrong, it was a significant liability that could destroy employee morale, increase turnover costs, and expose the company to devastating legal action. More importantly, it represented a fundamental failure of leadership, an indication that the values he thought he had instilled throughout the organization weren't being implemented at every level. Emily was nodding, her tears slowing as James's words helped her understand that her experiences weren't unique or imaginary. I always wondered if maybe I was being too sensitive, if this was just how corporate environments worked, and I needed to toughen up. Sarah wondered the same thing, James replied. But the truth is that treating people with basic respect isn't too much to ask, regardless of the industry or the pressure levels. Good managers find ways to maintain high standards without destroying people's dignity. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. He prided himself on creating a corporate culture that valued both excellence and humanity, but clearly, there were pockets of his organization where that culture hadn't taken root. The conversation he was witnessing suggested systematic problems that had somehow escaped his attention despite multiple layers of oversight and regular employee surveys. "What finally made your wife decide to report her supervisor?" Emily asked, her voice stronger now that she felt less alone in her struggles. James smiled sadly, remembering Sarah's transformation from victim to advocate. She realized that staying silent wasn't protecting anyone, including herself. Her supervisor's behavior was escalating, and Sarah understood that eventually someone else would be hired to replace the people who had quit or been driven away. She couldn't save herself by leaving, but she might be able to save the next person by speaking up. Emily thought about her replacement, some eager young graduate who would walk into the same toxic environment she had endured for 3 years. The idea of someone else suffering through Margaret's systematic cruelty sparked a sense of responsibility that had been dormant during her darkest moments of self-doubt. "I have a daughter," James continued, his voice taking on a protective edge that reminded Emily of her own father. "She's 8 years old, and Sunday she'll be entering the workforce. I want her to walk into offices where competence is rewarded, where making mistakes is treated as part of learning, where her value as a person isn't constantly called into question." End quote. Alexander found himself thinking about his own daughter, away at college studying business with dreams of following in his footsteps. The thought of her facing the kind of treatment Emily had described filled him with protective rage. He had assumed that his company's policies and training programs were sufficient to prevent such behavior, but clearly there was a gap between policy and practice that needed immediate attention. Emily was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of James's words and the implications for her own situation. She thought about the documentation she had carefully maintained, the emails she had saved, the witnesses who had observed Margaret's behavior but had remained silent out of fear for their own positions. "What if I report her and nothing happens?" Emily asked, voicing the fear that had kept her paralyzed for months. "What if they investigate and decide that her management style is just tough but effective? What if it makes things worse for me and anyone else who might speak up in the future?" James understood her fear, remembering Sarah's sleepless nights, before she finally decided to file her complaint. The risk was real. Companies sometimes protected problematic managers if they generated results or had political connections within the organization. But the cost of silence was also real, measured in destroyed careers, damaged mental health, and lost potential. "Those are valid concerns," James admitted. "But the alternative is accepting that this is just how things are, that good people have to suffer in silence while bullies hold power. Sarah used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite being afraid." Alexander felt a surge of admiration for both the janitor's wisdom and Emily's courage in having this conversation. He made a mental note to ensure that any investigation would be conducted by external consultants to eliminate potential conflicts of interest and guarantee objectivity. Emily looked down at her hands, noting the slight tremor that had become constant during her months at Pinnacle Industries. The stress had manifested in physical symptoms, sleepless nights, digestive issues, and a persistent anxiety that followed her home each evening. She thought about her dreams when she first accepted this position, the excitement of working for a prestigious company and contributing to important projects. "I miss feeling proud of my work," Emily said quietly. "I used to love the challenge of complex analysis, the satisfaction of presenting clean data that helped inform important decisions. Now I second-guess every choice, every word, every formatting decision, because I know it will be criticized regardless of how well-reasoned it might be." End quote. James nodded, recognizing the description of a confidence that had been systematically eroded. Sarah had gone through the same process, transforming from an enthusiastic professional into someone who questioned her most basic competencies despite years of successful performance. "That pride can come back," James assured her. Sarah found it again once she got away from that toxic environment. It took time, and she had to relearn how to trust her own judgment, but the skills and passion were still there underneath all the damage that had been done. Alexander was taking mental notes, understanding that the conversation represented far more than one employee's complaints about a difficult supervisor. This was a systemic failure that had allowed toxic behavior to flourish unchecked, potentially affecting multiple departments and dozens of employees throughout the organization. Emily stood up slowly, her legs unsteady after sitting hunched over her desk for so many hours. She looked at the scattered reports, seeing them with new perspective. Instead of evidence of her inadequacy, they represented documentation of unreasonable demands and moving goalposts designed to ensure failure regardless of effort or competence. "Thank you," Emily said, her voice carrying genuine gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped to talk with me tonight. I was so close to just disappearing, to walking away without saying anything to anyone." James smiled, thinking about Lucy and the lesson he hoped to teach her about standing up for others who couldn't stand up for themselves. Sometimes all we need is for someone to remind us that we're not crazy, that what we're experiencing isn't normal or acceptable. Alexander watched as Emily began gathering her papers, her movements more decisive than they had been when he first observed her. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. She had rediscovered her own agency after months of feeling powerless and isolated. "I'm going to do it," Emily announced, the words surprising her with their firmness. "I'm going to file a formal complaint tomorrow morning. Not just about tonight, but about everything that's been happening since I started working here." James felt a swell of pride, remembering the night Sarah had made the same decision. It hadn't been easy for her, and it wouldn't be easy for Emily, but it was the right thing to do for herself and for everyone who would come after her. "You're braver than you know," James told her. "And you're not alone in this. There are people in this building who will listen, who will take your concerns seriously, who will do the right thing once they understand what's really happening." Alexander silently echoed James's assurance, already planning the comprehensive investigation that would begin first thing in the morning. He thought about the multiple levels of management between his office and Emily's desk, wondering how such obvious dysfunction had escaped notice for so long. Emily packed her belongings carefully, treating her documentation with the respect it deserved as evidence of systematic workplace abuse. She thought about her college friends who had left similar situations, wondering if things might have been different for them, if someone had offered the same kind of support and validation she had received tonight. "Will you be here tomorrow night?" Emily asked, realizing that James had become an unexpected anchor in what would certainly be a difficult period ahead. James nodded, understanding that she would need ongoing support as she navigated the complaint process. "Every night except weekends. And if you need to talk, to process what's happening, or just to have someone remind you that you're doing the right thing, I'll be here." Alexander made another mental note, recognizing that the janitor had provided more effective employee support than any of the formal systems supposedly designed for that purpose. There were clearly lessons to be learned about how genuine care and human connection could accomplish what policies and procedures had failed to achieve. Emily walked toward the elevator, her posture straighter than it had been in months. She felt nervous about the confrontation ahead, but also relieved to finally be taking action rather than simply enduring abuse in silence. The weight of her decision felt manageable now that she knew she wasn't alone. James returned to his cleaning cart, but his mind remained focused on the conversation and its implications. He thought about Sarah, about the courage it had taken for her to challenge a system that seemed designed to protect those in power at the expense of those seeking justice. Emily's situation was different in its details but identical in its fundamental injustice. Alexander waited until both Emily and James had left the floor before emerging from the shadows. He walked to Emily's desk, noting the quality of the work that lay scattered across its surface, work that had apparently been criticized and rejected despite its obvious competence. The red ink corrections seemed arbitrary and excessive, suggesting a pattern of harassment rather than legitimate professional feedback. He made his way back to his own office, his mind racing with plans for the investigation that would begin tomorrow. This wasn't just about Emily Harper or Margaret Blackstone. It was about the culture he had tried to build and the gaps that had allowed toxicity to flourish in pockets of his organization. Alexander spent the rest of the night reviewing personnel files, looking for patterns that might indicate similar problems in other departments. He cross-referenced employee turnover rates with supervisor evaluations, searching for discrepancies that might have been overlooked by human resources. The data painted a troubling picture of blind spots in his organization's oversight systems. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly B, matching Emily's mood as she prepared for what would likely be the most difficult day of her professional life. She had spent the sleepless night reviewing her documentation, organizing her evidence, and rehearsing the conversation she would have with human resources. James's words echoed in her mind, providing strength when her courage wavered. Margaret Blackstone arrived at the office that morning in her typical aggressive mood, prepared to continue her systematic campaign against Emily. She had no way of knowing that her behavior had been witnessed and discussed, that plans were already in motion that would expose years of carefully concealed workplace abuse. Emily waited until mid-morning before making her way to the Human Resources Department, her heart pounding, but her resolve firm. She carried a thick folder containing months of documentation, evidence that told a clear story of harassment and intimidation. The receptionist, noting Emily's nervous demeanor and the serious nature of her request, immediately scheduled a meeting with the director. Alexander had arrived early and spent the morning reviewing personnel policies and speaking with external consultants who specialized in workplace harassment investigations. He wanted to ensure that Emily's complaint would be handled with the professionalism and objectivity it deserved, that there would be no possibility of the investigation being compromised by internal politics or conflicts of interest. The Human Resources Director, Janet Morrison, was a 20-year veteran of corporate personnel management who had seen her share of workplace conflicts and complaints. But as she reviewed Emily's documentation, she realized she was looking at something far more serious than the typical personality clashes or communication breakdowns that comprised most of her caseload. Emily sat across from Janet's desk, her hands trembling slightly as she walked through months of evidence. Each incident she described painted a picture of systematic abuse designed to undermine her confidence in professional development. Janet listened with growing concern, recognizing patterns that suggested deliberate harassment rather than simply ineffective management. "This is very thorough documentation," Janet told Emily, her voice carrying both admiration and concern. "It's clear that you've been dealing with a very difficult situation for an extended period. I want you to know that we take these allegations seriously and will conduct a full investigation." Emily felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. She was glad to finally be heard, but worried about the potential consequences of challenging a supervisor who held significant power within the organization. Margaret had allies throughout the company, people who might view Emily's complaint as disloyalty or troublemaking rather than legitimate protest against abusive treatment. Alexander received a call from Janet within hours of Emily's meeting, a briefing that confirmed his worst fears about the culture gaps in his organization. The evidence suggested not just individual bad behavior, but systematic failures in oversight and accountability that had allowed such behavior to continue unchecked for years. "I want external investigators brought in immediately," Alexander instructed Janet. "And I want a comprehensive review of all personnel practices in that department, not just Margaret's direct reports. This kind of behavior doesn't exist in isolation. There are usually enabling factors and complicit witnesses that need to be identified and addressed." Janet nodded, understanding the serious implications of the situation. A harassment investigation of this magnitude could expose the company to significant legal liability if not handled properly, but ignoring the problem would be both morally wrong and ultimately more damaging to the organization's reputation and effectiveness. Margaret Blackstone received notice of the investigation that afternoon, delivered by security personnel who escorted her to a conference room where she was informed that she was being placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of an external review. Her initial reaction was outrage and denial, insisting that Emily was simply a disgruntled employee who couldn't meet professional standards. "This is ridiculous," Margaret protested, her face flushed with anger and indignation. "Emily Harper is a mediocre employee at best, who has been looking for excuses to avoid accountability from the day she was hired. If she's unhappy with my management style, she should find work somewhere that doesn't require actual competence." The external investigator, Rebecca Chen, was a former federal prosecutor who specialized in workplace harassment cases. She had seen Margaret's type before: supervisors who use their authority to mask personal insecurities and maintain control through intimidation rather than leadership. Rebecca's approach was methodical and thorough, designed to uncover the full scope of problematic behavior while protecting potential victims from retaliation. Emily's first interview with Rebecca lasted 3 hours and covered everything from her initial hiring through the previous night's breakdown. Rebecca was impressed by the quality and comprehensiveness of Emily's documentation, evidence that would make it difficult for anyone to dismiss her allegations as subjective or exaggerated. "You've done exactly what I would advise any harassment victim to do," Rebecca told Emily. "This level of documentation creates a clear pattern that can't be explained away as personality conflicts or communication misunderstandings. You've built a strong case for systematic abuse." Word of the investigation spread quickly through the office, carried by whispered conversations and speculative emails. Some employees expressed support for Emily, sharing their own stories of problematic interactions with Margaret. Others worried about the implications for their own job security, concerned that speaking out against a supervisor might mark them as troublemakers. James continued his nightly cleaning routine, but found himself paying closer attention to the conversations and interactions he witnessed during his rounds. He had always been observant, but Emily's situation had heightened his awareness of the subtle signs of workplace toxicity that might otherwise be dismissed as normal corporate stress. 3 days into the investigation, Rebecca had interviewed 15 current and former employees, painting a picture of Margaret's behavior that extended far beyond her treatment of Emily. The pattern was consistent. Young employees, particularly women, were subjected to impossible standards, constant criticism, and systematic undermining designed to erode their confidence and effectiveness. "She told me that my college education was worthless and that I needed to learn how business really worked," testified Jennifer Walsh, a former employee who had left 6 months earlier after enduring similar treatment. "Every day I felt like I was walking on eggshells, afraid that any small mistake would prove that I didn't belong in a professional environment." Alexander reviewed Rebecca's preliminary findings with growing dismay. The investigation had uncovered not just individual misconduct, but organizational failures that had allowed such behavior to flourish. Multiple employees had attempted to report problems through official channels, only to have their complaints minimized or ignored by managers who viewed Margaret as effective, despite her controversial methods. "This represents a systematic failure of leadership at multiple levels," Rebecca informed Alexander during their confidential briefing. Margaret Blackstone's behavior was an open secret that everyone chose to ignore because she generated results and maintained order in her department. The culture enabled her abuse by prioritizing short-term productivity over employee welfare. Emily found herself at the center of a corporate earthquake that affected dozens of employees and multiple departments. Some colleagues expressed gratitude for her courage in speaking out, sharing their own stories of mistreatment that they had been afraid to report. Others seemed resentful, worried that the investigation would disrupt their comfortable routines or expose their own complicity in maintaining toxic dynamics. "I always knew something was wrong," confided Maria Santos, another secretary who had worked under Margaret for 2 years. "But I thought maybe it was just me, that I was being too sensitive or needed to develop thicker skin. Seeing your documentation made me realize that what we were experiencing wasn't normal or acceptable." Alexander decided to address the entire company during an emergency all-hands meeting, recognizing that the investigation had created anxiety and uncertainty that needed to be addressed directly. He had built Pinnacle Industries on principles of integrity and respect, values that had clearly not been implemented consistently throughout all levels of the organization. "We are conducting a comprehensive review of our workplace culture and management practices," Alexander announced to the assembled employees. "This process is designed to ensure that every person in this organization can perform their best work in an environment free from harassment, intimidation, and abuse. We will not tolerate behavior that undermines these fundamental principles." The investigation took 6 weeks to complete, during which time Margaret remained on administrative leave, while Emily continued her work under temporary supervision. The new dynamic revealed how productive the department could be when employees weren't constantly worried about arbitrary criticism and unreasonable demands. Rebecca's final report documented systematic harassment that had affected more than 20 employees over 5 years, creating a hostile work environment that violated both company policies and federal employment laws. The financial cost to the organization, measured in turnover, lost productivity, and legal exposure, exceeded $2 million, far more than the savings generated by Margaret's aggressive management approach. Margaret Blackstone's termination is effective immediately, Alexander announced during a private meeting with the department's remaining staff. We are also implementing comprehensive changes to our oversight and reporting systems to ensure that such behavior cannot continue undetected in the future. Emily felt a mixture of relief and vindication as she watched Margaret clear out her office under security supervision. The woman who had made her life miserable for 3 years looked smaller somehow, diminished by the exposure of her behavior and the consequences that had finally caught up with her. There was no satisfaction in Margaret's downfall, only a sense that justice had been served and future employees would be protected from similar abuse. Alexander personally met with Emily the day after Margaret's termination, an encounter that would prove transformative for both of them. He had read every page of Rebecca's report and understood that Emily's courage in speaking out had prevented further damage to dozens of current and future employees. Her documentation and willingness to endure a difficult investigation had exposed systematic problems that could have continued indefinitely without intervention. "I owe you a personal apology," Alexander told Emily as they sat in his corner office overlooking the city skyline. "The behavior you experienced should never have been tolerated in any organization, let alone one that claims to value integrity and respect. Your courage in coming forward has helped us identify and address problems that we should have caught much earlier." Emily was nervous about meeting with the CEO, uncertain about his intentions, and worried that despite the investigation's conclusions, she might still face subtle retaliation for having disrupted the company's operations. But Alexander's genuine remorse and commitment to change were evident in both his words and his immediate actions to reform the organization's culture and oversight systems. "I want to offer you a position in corporate development," Alexander continued, surprising Emily with an opportunity that represented a significant advancement from her current role. "Your analytical skills and attention to detail are exactly what we need for strategic planning and market analysis. More importantly, your integrity and courage demonstrate the kind of character we need in leadership positions." The offer was generous beyond Emily's expectations, including a substantial salary increase, expanded responsibilities, and direct reporting to senior management. But more than the financial benefits, it represented validation of her professional worth and potential, confirmation that her struggles under Margaret had been about toxic management rather than personal inadequacy. Emily accepted the position with gratitude and determination to prove herself worthy of Alexander's confidence. She understood that her promotion would be scrutinized by colleagues who might view it as compensation for her complaint rather than recognition of her abilities. The challenge of succeeding in a highly visible role while navigating the politics of her elevated status would require all the resilience she had developed during her months of adversity. James learned about Emily's promotion through the office grapevine, information that reached the night maintenance crew through the informal networks that connected all levels of the organization. He felt proud of her courage and success, though he also understood that her real challenges were just beginning as she navigated the complex dynamics of corporate advancement. "You helped save my career," Emily told James during one of their occasional conversations in the empty corridors. "That night, when you found me crying at my desk, I was ready to give up on everything I had worked toward. Your words gave me the strength to fight for myself." James smiled, thinking about Sarah and the lesson she had taught him about the ripple effects of courage and compassion. One person's willingness to speak truth in difficult moments could change entire systems, protecting countless others who might otherwise suffer in silence. Emily's success represented validation, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small by those in positions of power. The investigation's aftermath transformed Pinnacle Industries in ways that extended far beyond Margaret's termination. Alexander implemented comprehensive reforms, including mandatory management training, anonymous reporting systems, regular culture surveys, and external oversight of personnel practices. The changes were designed to prevent similar situations while encouraging open communication and accountability at all organizational levels. Rebecca Chen was retained as a consultant to monitor the company's progress and ensure that the cultural changes were implemented effectively rather than simply existing on paper. Her ongoing involvement provided credibility to the reform process and reassurance to employees that their concerns would be taken seriously by leadership. Emily's success in her new position exceeded everyone's expectations, including her own. Free from the constant stress and undermining that had characterized her previous role, she flourished in an environment that valued her contributions and supported her professional development. Her strategic analysis and market insights proved invaluable to several major business initiatives, demonstrating the talent that had been suppressed under Margaret's toxic management. "She's exactly what we needed in corporate development," Alexander told his senior staff during a quarterly review meeting. Her combination of analytical skills, attention to detail, and ethical grounding makes her invaluable for long-term strategic planning. "We almost lost someone with tremendous potential because we failed to address obvious management problems." The broader implications of Emily's case rippled throughout the industry as word spread about Pinnacle Industries' comprehensive response to workplace harassment. Other companies began reviewing their own policies and practices, recognizing that toxic management could represent significant legal and financial risks that were no longer acceptable in modern business environments. James continued his nightly cleaning routine with renewed sense of purpose, understanding that his work was part of a larger ecosystem where everyone's contributions mattered. He had learned that sometimes the most important conversations happened in empty corridors and dimly lit offices, moments when genuine human connection could cut through corporate hierarchies and artificial barriers. Lucy Rodriguez, now 9 years old, had begun showing interest in her father's work and the building where he spent his nights. James occasionally brought her to the office on weekends when he needed to catch up on special projects, giving her glimpses of the professional world she would someday enter. He hoped that by the time she was ready for her career, workplaces would be more welcoming and supportive than they had been for her mother or for Emily. "Daddy, why do you like working at night when everyone else is sleeping?" Lucy asked during one of their weekend visits to Pinnacle Industries. She was fascinated by the empty offices and the view from the 42nd floor, trying to understand how her father fit into the complex world of corporate business. James considered her question carefully, wanting to give her an answer that captured both the practical realities of their situation and the deeper meaning he had found in his work. "Sometimes the most important things happen when nobody's watching," he told her. "I help keep this place clean and safe so that all the people who work here during the day can do their best work. And sometimes I get to help in other ways too." Emily's story became a case study in business schools and management training programs, an example of how individual courage could expose systematic problems and drive organizational change. Her experience demonstrated that effective whistleblowing required not just personal bravery, but also careful documentation, strategic thinking, and institutional support for those willing to challenge problematic authority. Margaret Blackstone's termination and the subsequent investigation had legal implications that extended beyond Pinnacle Industries. Several former employees who had left the company due to her harassment filed lawsuits seeking compensation for constructive dismissal and emotional distress. The company ultimately settled these cases for substantial amounts, financial consequences that reinforced the business case for maintaining respectful workplace cultures. Alexander used the experience to become an advocate for workplace reform throughout the business community. He spoke at conferences and industry gatherings about the hidden costs of toxic management and the competitive advantages that came from creating genuinely supportive work environments. His message resonated with other executives who recognized similar problems in their own organizations. "We learned that culture isn't just about mission statements and corporate values posted on walls," Alexander explained during a keynote address at a leadership conference. "Culture is what happens in everyday interactions between managers and employees. especially when those interactions aren't being observed by senior leadership. We have to create systems that support and reward positive behavior while quickly identifying and addressing problematic patterns. Emily's success attracted attention from executive recruiters and other companies seeking to hire talented professionals with proven integrity and resilience. She chose to remain at Pinnacle Industries, partly out of loyalty to Alexander and the reforms he had implemented, but also because she felt a sense of ownership in the cultural transformation she had helped initiate. "This company gave me a chance to rebuild my career after I had almost given up," Emily explained to a recruiter who offered her a position at a competing firm. "I want to be part of the solution here, to help ensure that other employees have the support and opportunities that I've been given." James's role in the transformation was largely invisible to most of the company's employees, but Emily made sure that his contribution was recognized and valued. She recommended him for additional compensation and requested that his daughters receive educational scholarships through the company's community outreach program. These gestures were small compared to the support he had provided during her darkest moment, but they represented acknowledgement of his crucial intervention. The changes at Pinnacle Industries attracted positive media attention and industry recognition, positioning the company as a leader in workplace culture reform. Employee satisfaction scores improved dramatically, turnover rates decreased significantly, and productivity increased as workers felt more secure and valued in their positions. Rebecca Chen's follow-up report 18 months after the initial investigation documented substantial progress in creating a more positive and supportive work environment. Anonymous employee surveys showed increased confidence in reporting systems, higher trust in management, and greater satisfaction with career development opportunities. The reforms had succeeded in changing not just policies, but actual behavior and attitudes throughout the organization. Emily was promoted again 2 years after her initial advancement, this time to Director of Strategic Initiatives with responsibility for overseeing major corporate development projects. Her success had become a symbol of the company's transformation, proof that talent could flourish when given appropriate support and recognition. "I never could have imagined where that terrible night would lead," Emily reflected during an interview with a business magazine that was writing about corporate culture transformation. "I thought my career was over, that I would have to leave and start over somewhere else. Instead, I found myself in a position where I could help shape the kind of workplace culture I had dreamed of but never experienced." James's daughter Lucy was now 11 years old and showing strong academic performance that suggested college potential despite their modest financial circumstances. The educational benefits Emily had arranged through Alexander's community program had relieved significant financial pressure and allowed James to focus on being present for Lucy's childhood rather than working multiple jobs to cover educational expenses. Alexander had learned valuable lessons about leadership that extended far beyond the specific incident with Margaret and Emily. He implemented regular walking tours of all company facilities during OF hours, following James's example of observing the organization from different perspectives and time frames. These visits often revealed insights about employee morale and operational challenges that weren't apparent during normal business hours. The janitor who had provided comfort to a crying secretary had unknowingly triggered a chain of events that transformed an entire corporate culture and protected countless future employees from harassment and abuse. James's simple act of human kindness, his willingness to see Emily's pain and validate her experience, had demonstrated the power of individual actions to create systemic change. Emily established a mentorship program for junior employees, particularly young women entering the corporate world for the first time. Her own experience had taught her the importance of having allies and advocates who could provide guidance and support during difficult periods. The program paired experienced professionals with newer employees, creating networks of mutual support that helped prevent isolation and vulnerability. "Every young professional should have someone in their corner," Emily explained during the program's launch event. "Not necessarily someone in a position of authority, but someone who cares about their success and well-being as a complete person. Sometimes the most important support comes from unexpected sources." James was invited to speak at the mentorship program's launch, an opportunity to share his perspective on the importance of looking out for one another across all levels of organizational hierarchy. His remarks were brief but powerful, emphasizing that everyone had the capacity to make a positive difference in someone else's professional journey. "We all have moments when we need someone to remind us of our worth," James told the assembled group of mentors and mentees. "Sometimes that person might be a supervisor or colleague, but sometimes it might be someone you wouldn't expect. The important thing is being willing to offer that reminder when you see someone who needs it." The success of Pinnacle Industries' cultural transformation attracted attention from government agencies and advocacy organizations working on workplace harassment prevention. Emily was invited to testify before congressional committees, considering legislation to strengthen protections for employees who report misconduct and abuse. "My experience demonstrates both the problems with current systems and the potential for positive change when organizations commit to genuine reform," Emily told the Congressional Subcommittee on Workplace Safety. "But individual courage shouldn't be required for basic workplace dignity. We need stronger protections and clearer consequences for harassment and abuse." Alexander's advocacy for workplace culture reform led to his appointment to several industry boards and committees focused on employment practices and corporate responsibility. His experience with the Emily Harper case had given him credibility and insight that proved valuable in broader efforts to improve workplace conditions across multiple sectors. The financial impact of the culture transformation exceeded Alexander's most optimistic projections. Reduced turnover saved millions in recruiting and training costs, while improved employee engagement drove innovation and productivity gains that translated directly to increased profitability. The business case for respectful workplace culture proved itself in measurable bottom-line results. James's quiet wisdom and compassionate intervention had set in motion changes that protected hundreds of employees and transformed one of the city's largest corporations. His example inspired others to speak up when they witnessed injustice and to offer support when they encountered colleagues in distress. The ripple effects of his kindness continued to spread throughout the organization and beyond. Emily's documentation of her harassment experience became a template used by employment attorneys and advocacy organizations to help other victims build strong cases against workplace abuse. Her methodical approach to recording incidents and preserving evidence demonstrated the importance of preparation in challenging powerful individuals and institutional inertia. The external investigation led by Rebecca Chen established new standards for thoroughness and objectivity in workplace harassment cases. Her methodology was adopted by other consulting firms and became a model for how such investigations should be conducted to ensure fairness and credibility for all parties involved. Margaret Blackstone's termination and the exposure of her behavior served as a cautionary tale throughout the industry, demonstrating that even seemingly untouchable managers could face consequences when their actions were properly documented and investigated. Her case became required study in management training programs as an example of how not to exercise supervisory authority. Alexander's commitment to transparency and accountability in addressing the harassment case earned respect from employees, investors, and industry peers. His willingness to acknowledge institutional failures and implement comprehensive reforms demonstrated the kind of leadership that could transform organizational culture while protecting the company's reputation and financial performance. James continued his night shift work with the satisfaction of knowing that his intervention had made a lasting difference. He had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply acknowledge another person's pain and remind them of their inherent worth. His example inspired other maintenance and support staff to be more attentive to signs of employee distress and to speak up when they witnessed problematic behavior. Lucy Rodriguez grew up understanding that her father's work was valuable not just for the income it provided, but for the contribution he made to creating a workplace where people could thrive. She learned lessons about courage, compassion, and the importance of standing up for others that would shape her own approach to life and work. Emily's success in her expanded role proved that talent and dedication could overcome even the most challenging obstacles when supported by ethical leadership and fair management practices. Her story inspired other employees who had experienced harassment or discrimination to document their experiences and seek appropriate recourse through proper channels. The transformation at Pinnacle Industries demonstrated that corporate culture could be changed through committed leadership, employee courage, and systematic reforms that addressed root causes rather than just surface Symptoms. The company became a case study in successful organizational change and a model for other businesses seeking to improve their workplace environments. Years later, as Emily advanced to senior executive positions and James's daughter Lucy prepared for college with full scholarship support, both would remember that midnight conversation as a turning point that changed not just their individual lives, but the entire trajectory of their careers and dreams. The simple act of one person comforting another in a moment of despair had unleashed forces of positive change that continued to benefit countless others long after that difficult night had ended. The legacy of James Rodriguez's compassionate intervention and Emily Harper's courageous stand against workplace abuse lived on in the policies, practices, and culture of Pinnacle Industries, creating an environment where future employees could pursue their professional goals without fear of harassment or intimidation. Their story proved that individual actions, no matter how small they might seem, had the power to transform entire systems and protect generations of workers from abuse and injustice. Alexander Hawthorne's leadership in responding to the crisis demonstrated that executives who took employee welfare seriously could create competitive advantages while fulfilling moral obligations to their workforce. His example inspired other CEOs to examine their own organizational cultures and implement reforms before problems escalated to crisis levels. The single dad janitor who had stopped to comfort a crying secretary had unknowingly become a catalyst for corporate transformation that protected hundreds of employees and set new standards for workplace dignity throughout the industry. His simple act of human kindness proved that everyone, regardless of their position in the organizational hierarchy, had the power to make a positive difference in the lives of others and the health of the institutions where they worked. Rebecca Chen's investigation and the subsequent reforms became a template for other organizations facing similar challenges, demonstrating that systematic harassment could be identified and eliminated through proper investigation techniques and committed leadership. Her work helped establish new professional standards for addressing workplace misconduct in corporate environments. The story of Pinnacle Industries' transformation spread throughout the business community as an example of how crisis could become opportunity when organizations responded with integrity and commitment to genuine change. Emily's courage in speaking out and Alexander's leadership in implementing reforms created a model for other companies seeking to build cultures of respect and accountability. James Rodriguez's example reminded everyone that the most important conversations often happened in quiet moments between people who might never meet again, but whose brief connection could change the trajectory of entire lives and careers. His willingness to see Emily's pain and offer validation and hope had unleashed forces of positive change that continued to ripple through the organization and industry years after their initial encounter. The night shift janitor's simple words, "You deserve better," had become a rallying cry for workplace dignity and human respect that inspired employees at all levels to demand better treatment and offer better support. Their colleagues. His legacy lived on in every policy reform, every act of kindness, and every instance of someone speaking up to protect others from abuse and injustice in professional environments everywhere.